I've always been the kind of person who enjoys late-night drives. There's something about the emptiness of the road that's soothing. I'd roll down the window, let the cool air sweep in, and let the silence wash over me. I lived in a small town, surrounded by endless stretches of woods and fields. It was peaceful, or so I thought. Most nights, after spending time at my girlfriend's place, I'd hop into my car and head back home. The drive wasn't long, 10, maybe 15 minutes at most. It should have been uneventful, just like every other night. But some nights, something felt different. It always started the same. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the two-lane road ahead. On either side, trees lined the route, their branches forming a canopy overhead. The hum of my tires was the only sound, apart from the occasional rustling of leaves when the wind decided to stir. I'd listen to the low hum of the radio, letting the familiar tunes ease my mind. Everything seemed normal. But then, there were those nights when normal didn't seem quite right. I remember one of those nights vividly. It had been a typical evening with my girlfriend. We talked, laughed, and lost track of time, as we often did. Midnight had crept up on us, and it was time for me to head home. The weather was crisp, the kind that makes you want to pull your jacket tighter. As I drove down the back roads, something felt off. I couldn't place it at first. Maybe it was the way the shadows stretched longer than usual, or the way the wind seemed to whisper against the car. I told myself I was imagining things. After all, it was late, and I was tired. About halfway through the drive, I noticed something odd in my rear view mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw movement, just a blur, something shifting in the distance. I glanced again, but there was nothing there. The road behind me was as empty as it had been all night. Still, my grip on the steering wheel tightened. I turned up the volume on the radio, trying to drown out the unease creeping in. It was nothing, I told myself, just my mind playing tricks. But the feeling didn't go away. The farther I drove, the heavier it became, like a weight pressing down on me. The trees seemed darker, their branches clawing at the night sky. The air inside the car felt colder, even with the heater on. I glanced at the dashboard, at the familiar glow of the speedometer, trying to focus on anything other than the sense of being watched. And then it happened. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shadow, just at the edge of the road. At first, I thought it was a deer or maybe some stray animal. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't moving. It was just standing there, still and silent. My breath caught as I tried to make sense of it. A person out here? At this hour? I slowed down, my headlights sweeping over the figure. They were cloaked in darkness, their face obscured. I couldn't make out any details, just the outline of someone or something standing unnaturally still. My heart skipped, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. I pressed the gas, speeding past the figure. As I drove by, I dared a quick glance in the rearview mirror. The road was empty again. The figure was gone. I swallowed hard, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. It's nothing, I told myself again. Just shadows, just the dark playing tricks. But deep down, I didn't believe it. When I finally pulled into my driveway, the relief was almost overwhelming. The safety of home never felt so comforting. I sat in the car for a moment, trying to shake off the lingering unease. The night was quiet again, just the way it should be. But even as I climbed into bed, I couldn't shake the image of that figure, standing motionless on the roadside. I told myself I'd imagined it, that it was nothing to worry about. But something about it felt wrong. The next time I took that drive, I couldn't help but scan the road for anything unusual. The shadows seemed darker, the silence heavier. Every now and then I'd catch a glimpse of movement in the corner of my eye. It was always fleeting, always just out of reach. One night, as I rounded a bend, I thought I saw the figure again. This time, it was farther down the road, barely visible in the glow of my headlights. I slowed down, squinting into the darkness, but by the time I got closer, there was nothing there. I laughed nervously, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. "Get a grip," I muttered under my breath. But the unease lingered, crawling up my spine like a cold hand. As I approached the turn to my girlfriend's house, I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me. I checked the rearview mirror again. Nothing. Just the empty road stretching behind me. I shook my head, forcing myself to focus on the drive. That night, as I left her house and made my way home, the sense of unease was stronger than ever. The trees lining the road seemed to lean in closer, their branches casting strange, twisted shadows. The headlights illuminated the asphalt ahead, but it felt like the darkness was closing in around me. I told myself it was just another quiet night, nothing to be afraid of. But deep down, I knew better. Halfway home, I saw it again. This time, the figure was closer. It stood by the roadside, shrouded in shadow. My breath hitched as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. I slowed down, my eyes locked on the figure. But just as before, as I got closer, it vanished. One moment it was there, the next it was gone, swallowed by the night. My chest tightened as I forced myself to keep driving, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. By the time I reached my driveway, I was a bundle of nerves. I parked the car and hurried inside, locking the door behind me. The house was quiet, but it didn't feel like the sanctuary it usually was. I peered out the window, half expecting to see the figure standing at the edge of the yard. But the night was still, the shadows unmoving. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the irrational fear. It was just the darkness playing tricks. That's all it was. But even as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The image of the figure stayed with me, etched into my mind. I closed my eyes, but sleep didn't come easily. And when it finally did, my dreams were filled with shadows. The nights didn't feel the same anymore. What had once been a comforting routine was now shrouded in something I couldn't explain. Each drive home from my girlfriend's house was heavier, darker, as though the air itself resisted my presence. I tried not to think too much about it. After all, what could I say? That shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should? That the silence felt louder than ever? No, I just kept driving, hoping each trip would be uneventful. But deep down, I knew better. It started subtly. One night, as I rounded a sharp turn, I caught something in my side mirror. At first, I thought it was just the reflection of a tree or a trick of the light. But then I realized it moved, not with the car, but toward it. A dark outline, fleeting yet deliberate, slipped out of view before I could focus on it. I shook my head and tightened my grip on the wheel. Maybe I was just tired, I thought. But the feeling stayed with me, like an itch I couldn't scratch. The next time it happened, it was clearer. I was passing an old barn, one of those abandoned places that dotted the countryside, when I saw it. A figure, standing just inside the broken doorway. Its posture was wrong, leaning slightly forward as though it was waiting for something. I kept my eyes on the road, refusing to look again, but I could feel it watching me. By the time I reached the next curve, my breath was shallow and my chest felt tight. The barn disappeared into the distance, but the image stayed with me. Each drive brought something new, something worse. Sometimes it was a shadow darting across the road just ahead of my headlights. Other times, it was the figure itself, standing at the edge of a field or between the trees. Always still, always silent. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just my imagination running wild. But it didn't matter how much I rationalized it, the fear stayed. It crept into my thoughts during the day, making me jump at small sounds or quick movements. Even at home, I couldn't escape it. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, sure I'd heard footsteps outside. Sometimes when I turned on the lights, I'd find objects slightly out of place. A chair moved an inch to the left, a door ajar that I was certain I'd closed. My girlfriend noticed my unease, of course. She asked me what was wrong, but I didn't know how to explain. Just tired, I'd say, forcing a smile. She didn't push, but I could see the worry in her eyes. One night, as I drove back, the figure's behavior changed. It no longer stayed on the periphery. I was nearing the halfway point of my drive when I saw it again, this time directly ahead of me. It stood in the middle of the road, its outline sharper, more defined than ever before. My headlights illuminated its twisted form. The arms seemed too long, the legs slightly bent as if they weren't used to standing. But it was the way it moved that froze me in place. It didn't walk. It slid, a jerking, unnatural motion that defied reason. I slammed on the brakes, my tires screeching against the asphalt. The figure stopped. It tilted its head as though curious, then took a single step forward. My chest tightened as I fumbled to put the car in reverse. The figure didn't follow. Instead, it stood there, watching, until I blinked. In that instant, it was gone. The road ahead was empty, as though nothing had been there at all. I sat in my car, my hands trembling on the wheel. The silence pressed in around me, broken only by the faint crackle of the radio. That was when the whispers started. At first, I thought it was just static, but as I listened, I realized there were voices buried within it. Low, faint, and unintelligible, they rose and fell like a chant. I turned the dial, trying to change the station, but the voices followed. No matter where I tuned, they were there, humming just beneath the surface. I turned the radio off, but the sound didn't stop. It filled the car, crawling into my ears and settling deep in my mind. When I finally got home, I barely made it inside before collapsing onto the couch. My heart was racing and my hands wouldn't stop shaking. I tried to convince myself that it was all in my head, that the figure was nothing more than a shadow, the voices just a trick of faulty equipment. But then I heard it again. A soft tapping coming from the window. I froze, every muscle in my body locking in place. The tapping came again, steady and deliberate. I didn't dare look. Instead, I sat there staring at the wall until the sound stopped. The next day, I tried to go about my routine as though nothing had happened. But it was impossible. Every creak of the floorboards, every shift of light through the curtains made my skin crawl. My girlfriend called, asking if I wanted to come over, but I couldn't bring myself to drive those roads again. I made up an excuse, something about needing to catch up on sleep. She didn't believe me, but she didn't press. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the dread returned. I couldn't sit still, pacing the house as though movement could keep the fear at bay. When the phone rang, I nearly jumped out of my skin. It was my girlfriend again, her voice tinged with worry. She asked if everything was okay, if I needed her to come over. I wanted to say yes, to have someone else here to prove I wasn't losing my mind. But I couldn't. Instead, I told her I was fine, promising to see her the next day. The storm rolled in around midnight. The wind howled, rattling the windows, and the rain came down in sheets. I tried to sleep, but the sound of the storm only made the silence between the thunderclaps more oppressive. When I closed my eyes, I saw the figure, its twisted form burned into my mind. I could almost hear the whispers again, faint and distant, like they were waiting for me to listen. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I drifted into a restless sleep. But even in my dreams, there was no escape. I was back on the road, the figure standing in the distance. This time, it moved toward me, its unnatural gait more pronounced. I tried to run, but my feet wouldn't move. The figure reached out, its hands stretching toward me, impossibly long. I woke with a start, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The storm had passed, leaving the house in an unsettling quiet. I told myself I wouldn't drive that night, that I'd stay home and let the unease pass. But something compelled me to go. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the hope that facing it would make it go away. As I got into the car, the air felt heavy, charged with something I couldn't name. The drive started normally enough, the familiar road stretching ahead of me, but as I neared the halfway point, the static returned, faint and crackling through the speakers. My stomach sank as I reached for the dial, but before I could turn it off, the whispers began. They were louder this time, more distinct. Words I couldn't understand tumbled over each other, their tone urgent and insistent. I gripped the wheel, my knuckles white, as the car seemed to slow of its own accord. The headlights dimmed, and for a moment I was plunged into darkness. When the light returned, the figure was there, standing in the middle of the road. This time, it didn't move. It just stood there, its head tilted as though studying me. My breath caught as I stared at it, unable to look away. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen in place. The rain began to fall again, the drops streaking the windshield like tears. I blinked, and the figure was gone. But the muddy footprints it left behind remained, leading straight toward my car. I slammed the gear into reverse, my tires spinning against the wet asphalt as I sped away. The whispers grew louder, filling the car until I thought my head would split. Then, just as suddenly as they began, they stopped. The radio went silent, the static fading into nothingness. When I pulled into my driveway, I didn't bother turning off the engine. I ran inside, locking the door behind me. The house was dark, the only light coming from the street lamp outside. I peered through the curtains, my breath fogging the glass. The yard was empty, the road quiet. but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The tapping started again, soft and deliberate, coming from the back window. I turned away, refusing to look. Whatever was out there, I didn't want to see it. The nights were no longer something I could endure without questioning every sound, every shadow. I knew there had to be more to this. It wasn't just my mind playing tricks, and it wasn't just some fleeting nightmare. The figure wasn't leaving, and I had to understand why. Each encounter had brought me closer to some unspoken truth, a truth that seemed buried beneath layers of fear and doubt. So, I began searching for answers. The first place I looked was the library. The local archives held records going back decades, even centuries, documenting everything from the town's founding to the smallest of local rumors. I spent hours combing through brittle newspapers and old journals, trying to make sense of the recurring presence of something that felt more like a shadow than a man. That's when I found it. A story about a young man who had disappeared on those same back roads more than 50 years ago. His name was Andrew Harper, and he'd vanished without a trace one stormy night. The reports were sparse, but they all pointed to one chilling detail. His car had been found abandoned in the middle of the road. The engine was still running, the driver's door open, but Andrew was nowhere to be seen. Witnesses claimed to have seen a figure on the road in the weeks leading up to his disappearance, but no one could agree on what they had actually seen. Some said it was a man in black. Others insisted it was just a trick of the light. The more I read, the more I felt the pieces falling into place. The old stories described the figure exactly as I'd seen it, tall and dark, with an unnatural stillness. The accounts varied, but they all shared one thing in common. Everyone who encountered it felt a deep, inexplicable dread. I found myself gripping the pages tighter as I read, my eyes scanning for every word. The figure wasn't just a ghost or a memory. It was something more, something that didn't belong in this world. As I dug deeper, I found mentions of other disappearances over the years, all tied to the same stretch of road. Each one was unexplained, each one marked by the sighting of the figure. I couldn't ignore the pattern. Whatever this thing was, it had been there for decades, maybe longer. And now, it had chosen me. I couldn't keep it to myself anymore. I told my girlfriend everything. At first, she thought I was joking, but as I laid out the details, her expression shifted. She didn't believe me, not fully, but she could see how serious I was. "Maybe you just need to stay off those roads for a while," she said, her voice soft but uncertain. "Maybe it's all just stress." I nodded, but I knew it wasn't that simple. Avoiding the roads wouldn't make the figure disappear. If anything, it felt like the more I avoided it, the stronger its presence became. The nights were heavier, the shadows deeper, and then the figure began to change. The first time it called my name, I was driving home after a late shift. The radio had been off, the silence in the car nearly unbearable. Then, out of nowhere, I heard it. My name? Spoken in a voice that didn't belong to anyone I knew. It was faint at first, barely a whisper, but it grew louder, filling the car like a storm. I turned the radio knob, hoping to drown it out, but the voice persisted. It was low and deliberate, each syllable dragging across my nerves like nails on a chalkboard. "Stop," it said. "Turn around." I couldn't. I pressed my foot harder on the gas, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly that my knuckles ached. The voice didn't stop. It repeated my name over and over, each time more distorted than the last. By the time I reached my driveway, my chest was tight and my head was spinning. I stumbled inside, locking the door behind me, but even then, I could still hear it, faint and distant, as though it was lingering just beyond the walls. The next time, it was worse. I was driving down the road, trying to focus on anything but the growing sense of dread, when I saw the figure in my rearview mirror. It was sitting in the back seat, its pale face barely visible in the dim light. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The car swerved slightly, and when I looked again, it was gone. But the cold it left behind stayed with me, seeping into my bones. I knew then that I couldn't avoid it any longer. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't going to leave me alone. I had to face it, no matter how much it terrified me. So one night, I made the decision. I told my girlfriend I wouldn't be coming over, that I needed to take care of something. She didn't press, but I could hear the worry in her voice. I drove out to the back roads, the air thick with an uneasy stillness. The The trees loomed over me, their branches casting long, jagged shadows across the asphalt. I turned off the radio, letting the silence fill the car. This time, I wasn't going to run. This time, I was going to confront it. As I drove, the road seemed to stretch longer than it should have. The curves were sharper, the trees denser. Time felt like it was slipping, the minutes blending together into a haze. And then, it appeared. The figure stood in the middle of the road, its outline sharper than ever before. I slowed the car, my headlights illuminating every detail. Its form was more solid now, more human, but its face was wrong. The features were twisted, like a reflection in a broken mirror. Its eyes were black voids, staring straight at me. I stepped out of the car, my legs trembling beneath me. The air was colder here, biting against my skin. The figure didn't move, it just stood there, waiting. I took a step forward, my voice shaky as I tried to speak. "What do you want?" The figure tilted its head, the movement slow and deliberate. Then it spoke. Its voice was low and hollow, echoing in a way that didn't make sense. "You know who I am." I shook my head, the words catching in my throat. I don't understand any of this." It took a step closer, the sound of its movements unnatural, like dry leaves scraping against each other. "You brought this on yourself," it said. "You saw me. You didn't look away." The world around me seemed to warp, the trees bending and twisting in impossible ways. The ground beneath my feet felt unsteady, like it was shifting with every step. The figure reached out a hand, its fingers impossibly long and pale. "This is not the end," it said, its voice cutting through the chaos like a knife. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding as the figure's form began to dissolve into the shadows. The air grew heavier, pressing down on me as I scrambled back to the car. When I finally slammed the door shut, the figure was gone, but the road ahead was no longer the same. The landscape had changed, the familiar curves replaced by endless darkness. I drove, not knowing where I was going, only that I had to get away. When I finally reached home, the exhaustion hit me like a wave. I stumbled inside, collapsing onto the couch. The whispers were gone, the shadows still. But I knew it wasn't over. The figure's words echoed in my mind, a reminder that this was far from finished. Whatever it was, whatever it wanted, it wasn't done with me yet. After that night, nothing felt the same. The roads, the house, even my reflection, everything seemed to carry a weight I couldn't shake. I tried to go back to normal, to live as if the figure had vanished with the dawn, but it hadn't. It was always there, in the corners of my vision, in the quiet moments when I thought I was finally alone. I'd catch shadows moving where there shouldn't be any, shapes that seemed to shift just as I turned my head. Mirrors became my worst enemy. Looking into them felt like opening a door I couldn't close. One morning, as I brushed my teeth, I saw it again. The figure's outline was faint, barely there, but unmistakable. It wasn't standing behind me. It was in the mirror itself, as though the glass held a different reality. I froze, toothpaste dripping from the corner of my mouth, unable to tear my eyes away. When I finally blinked, it was gone, but the chill it left behind lingered. I avoided mirrors after that, but it didn't help. The figure found other ways to make itself known. It started with the recordings. I'd play back voicemails or videos, and there it was, a faint, distorted whisper just beneath the sound. At first, I thought it was interference, some glitch in the technology. But the whispers grew clearer, more intentional. They said things I didn't want to hear, things that felt like they were meant just for me. "Don't forget. You can't run. This is only the beginning." I tried to ignore it, to act as though nothing was wrong. My girlfriend noticed, of course. She'd always been observant, but now her concern was sharper, more persistent. "You're not yourself," she said one evening, her voice soft but firm. "Something's wrong. You need to tell me what's going on." I wanted to. I wanted to unload everything, to let her carry even a fraction of the weight that was crushing me. But I didn't know where to start. How do you explain something that doesn't make sense, even to you? I shook my head, forcing a smile that didn't reach my eyes. "It's nothing," I said. "Just stress. Work's been crazy." She didn't believe me, but she didn't push. At least, not until she saw it for herself. It was late, and we were sitting on the couch, the TV playing some show neither of us was really watching. I had my arm around her, trying to pretend everything was fine, when she suddenly sat up straight. "What was that?" she asked, her eyes darting toward the window. What was what? I followed her gaze, but the yard outside was empty, bathed in the dim glow of the porch light. There was something there, she said, her voice trembling. I swear I saw someone. My stomach dropped. I wanted to tell her she was imagining things, that it was just a shadow or a trick of the light. But I couldn't. Not anymore. It's him, I said, the words heavy in my mouth. The figure, he's been following me. She turned to me, her face pale. Why didn't you tell me? I didn't have an answer. How could I? But now that she'd seen it, there was no going back. She believed me, and that made everything feel more real, more dangerous. We decided to leave. It was the only thing that made sense. If the figure was tied to the back roads, then getting away from them might break whatever connection it had to me. We packed up what we could and made plans to move across the state, far from the woods and the fields that had become a nightmare. I felt a glimmer of hope, a faint light at the end of a very dark tunnel. But deep down, I wasn't sure it would work. The day we left, the air felt heavier than usual, as though the world itself was trying to hold us back. We loaded the last box into the car and stood in the driveway looking at the house that had been our home. I wanted to feel sad, nostalgic, anything other than the gnawing dread that clung to me. But I couldn't. All I felt was relief that we were leaving. The drive was long, the roads winding through unfamiliar territory. At first, everything seemed fine. The figure didn't appear, and the silence in the car felt like a blessing. But as the miles stretched on, the unease crept back in. The shadows along the roadside seemed to shift, to lean closer as we passed. The whispers returned, faint but persistent, seeping into the edges of my mind. And then, as we neared the edge of town, he appeared. The figure was standing in the middle of the road, closer than ever before. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as the car came to a halt. My girlfriend gasped, clutching my arm as we stared at the thing blocking our path. This time, it didn't vanish. It stayed there, its form more solid, more menacing than ever. I couldn't move. My hands were frozen on the wheel, my mind racing but unable to form a single coherent thought. The figure took a step forward, its movements slow and deliberate. Its face was clearer now, the features twisted into something that barely resembled a person. The eyes were the worst, dark and empty, yet filled with a knowing that made my skin crawl. We have to go, my girlfriend whispered, her voice barely audible, but I couldn't. The car wouldn't start, and even if it did, I wasn't sure it would matter. The figure was closer now, its presence pressing against the air, making it hard to breathe. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The road ahead was empty, the shadows retreating to the edges of the trees. I started the car, my hands shaking, and we drove away as fast as we could. But the relief was short-lived. In the rearview mirror, I saw it again. The figure was standing at the edge of the road, its eyes locked on us. And as we rounded the bend, I could swear it smiled. We made it to the new house without another incident, but the peace didn't last. The figure was still with us, its presence a constant weight. It appeared in the shadows of the new backyard, in the mirrors of the unfamiliar rooms. It whispered through the cracks in the walls, through the static of the television. There was no escaping it. Moving hadn't helped. If anything, it had made things worse. The last time I saw it was the night we decided to leave again. I was sitting in the car, gripping the wheel as my girlfriend loaded the last of our belongings into the trunk. The figure was there, standing in the rearview mirror, its eyes locked on mine. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I just stared at it, my breath shallow, my chest tight. When my girlfriend got in the car, she didn't see it. She asked if I was okay, and I nodded, unable to speak. As we pulled out of the driveway, I glanced at the mirror one last time. The figure was gone, but the weight of its presence remained. It always would. Some things can't be escaped. Some shadows don't stay in the past. And as I sit here recounting everything that happened, I know this isn't the end. Not for me, and maybe not for you. If you've ever felt it, that chill, that sense of being watched when you're alone, then you know what I'm talking about. The shadows are always there, waiting. If you've had an experience like this, share it in the comments. Let us know we're not alone. And if you want to hear more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. because sometimes the shadows have more to say.